What's going on, Hot Take Nation? Before we start this week's show, I want to introduce a company and a personal friend of mine, Steve Moore, who I've coached hockey with. Our kids play hockey. He's been a longtime friend, and he is with Magnum Cementing Services, which has been a top-tier well cementing specialist for over 13 years, as well as providing plug and abandonment services. And boy, have they pumped a lot of cement. They have 50,000 jobs under their belt from every company from startups to majors. They have hundreds of skilled employees across North America, and they are proud to serve the Bakken and the U.S. Rockies region. Of late, their lab team has come up with a chemistry-based solution for the challenging Braden Head cementing issues in the DJ and have been kicking butt in horizontal wells in Powder River. I recommend you check them out. They have pumping equipment that's almost nearly all brand new, state-of-the-art, assembled and manufactured in-house, and most importantly, since entering the U.S. market in mid-2019, they have 0 man-hours lost to safety incidences. You know how I feel about safety. As I mentioned, they are a specialist in cementing services. They've added a new product line called Magnum Infrastructure, which does cement soil stabilization work. If you haven't heard of soil stabilization, it involves taking a cement slurry, mixing it in the soil for the purpose of constructing a more robust pad, road, or other surface. You can use it with feedlots, construction sites, foundations for roads and highways, lease roads, and well pads. Brand new business, but they've already performed lots of awesome work, and I suggest you check them out. The way you can get in front of my friend Steve Moore, you can call him 310-701-3113, or you can check them out at magnumcement.com or magnuminfrastructure.com. Steve and Magnum, appreciate your sponsorship. Excited about this week's show. On with the show. What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden-Wood here with another episode of Hot Take of the Day as we close in on 100 episodes. And someone I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time is Ryan Sitton, who joins us today. Ryan, first of all, thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So Ryan, you before we get into the book that you've released, I wanted to talk a little bit about your time with the RRC. And in particular, 2020 was kind of a crazy year, and it brought together a lot of focal points that you had focused on during your time there, but certainly OPEC and flaring. So let's start with OPEC, since it's kind of relevant that the Saudis surprised the market with a 1 million barrel a day unilateral cut this week. And I'm curious sort of your take on OPEC's approach through 2020, what you think the Saudis were up to versus, what you might have known. And I know you've had a lot of conversations with them. And then lastly, on the OPEC topic, how you think Texas and OPEC and the United States and OPEC, given where supply demand is right now, how it all comes together.
Wow, that's a lot. So you just want me to go for the next hour answer?
Yeah, exactly. I just thought I'd tee it up. You can go anywhere you want with that question. Sure.
Well, it's first of all, let me just tell you kind of the story, because as you said, this was a unique year, not just, coronavirus and lockdowns and those sort of things. And even just in the oil and gas business, not just a downturn. I mean, you've been in the business for decades. Downturns and upswings are a constant. What made this year unique was the fact that at some point we were probably down, I would say, between 30 and 35% of global oil consumption was gone. And we'd never seen that ever, not even close. You look back in history, there were times where maybe 5% of the market kind of went out at certain periods, but it was over the course of months or even a year that we kind of leveled into that. It wasn't in a matter of weeks. So this was unprecedented. And having been at the Railroad Commission for a while, and people out, while most people in Texas and in the country don't really understand the authority that the Railroad Commission has, when you look around the world, people who are thought leaders in oil and gas, they do. They know that the Railroad Commission has the authority to prorate oil production in Texas, because from the 1920s to the 1970s, the Railroad Commission was arguably the most powerful price-setting organization in the world, because they were controlling we were the swing producer in Texas. And a lot of people don't know that, but it was a really powerful place to be. Well, we get into this coronavirus, market prices are dropping through the floor. There's way too much oil on the market. You're starting to hear fears of filling up storage, of just massive kind of shut-in of wells and the long-term damage that would do. I mean, it was so speculative that fears were rampant. And somewhere probably a month or so, a month and a half in, I get my first call from the Secretary General of OPEC, Mohammed Barkindo. And great, really thoughtful, very nice guy, as you would imagine, leading that kind of international organization. And we start talking not so much about the oil industry, but about the global impacts of the pandemic and how oil, as one of many market segments, are going to both be affected by this and how they might affect things on the upswing. So when things start to come back, where will we be positioned? I'll tell the short version here. Over the next few weeks, I ended up connecting with Alexander Novak, who is the Russian oil minister, who I found equally thoughtful. He and I probably spent at one point an hour and a half on the phone. Once again, it was not about the oil business. It was about, hey, what will happen in the world if the oil business really craters in a way that we've never seen before? In fact, I remember my conversation with Novak, and here we are, the Russian oil minister and arguably one of the most powerful U.S. energy, oil regulators, having a pretty candid conversation and thinking not so much about our nations or about our industry, but about the world. And the comments going back and forth were, if we end up slamming in 20 million barrels a day of production, 20% of the world's oil production, and in ways that we don't control on the downside, then when the world wants more oil coming out of what looks like is going to be a really desperate recession, how will we recover? I mean, think about it, right? So imagine that here we are in April, May of 2020, trying to speculate a year out and saying, what if the world gets back to needing 90 or 95 million barrels a day of oil? But at that point, because of how we crash, we can only produce 85 million barrels of oil. What happens? And I remember Novak was speaking through a translator, and so there's this long pause in between our conversation. And at one point, he says something like, the translator, I hear this long Russian conversation, and the translator says, the world will perish. In other words, if we can't produce, if we can only produce 10%, if we only produce 90% of the oil that the world needs, oil prices will spike. Energy costs around the world will go out of control, and all of a sudden every business, every society that depends on affordable, reliable energy to function will be in serious question. So it was just almost a surreal experience to go through all this. I'm talking to folks I'm talking to the U.S. Energy Secretary. I'm talking to my counterparts in other states. If I were to say that the longest, at the end of the day, we did nothing, right? I mean, that's after all that conversation, all that speculation, there was a lot of talk and a lot of meetings, but nothing really happened. In the end, the market ended up coming back. People kind of were able to kind of control production. So it's worked out, I would say, okay. But I will tell you this, the one when people say, Ryan, you're looking back now, do you think we should have prorated? So, well, we don't have data yet. That data is going to come in 2021 and 2022. If we're sitting here in 2022 and the state of Texas at that point is struggling to produce, say, 11 to 12 million barrels a day. We were producing 13 and a half, nearly 14 at the beginning of 2020. If we struggle to get back to that where we're 2 million barrels a day off, then the answer will probably be, we probably should have prorated. We probably should have done things to create some stability. It wasn't gonna mean there was no layoffs. Wasn't going to mean that we didn't have a downturn, but it would mean that there would have been enough stability that some of the oil field service companies could have stayed around, right? Could have maintained some basic infrastructure. It would have meant that there was some storage available for intermittent production. And so we'll find out at the end of, over the next couple of years what that really means to all of us. But it will be an interesting study. I think books will be written, when the next version of The Prize is written in 10 or 20 years and kind of look at what happened during the pandemic, there will be a whole lot of speculation about what that meant to us and the future, frankly, of the industry and even to some degree, the American industries that depend on that energy.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll dive back into the comparison of talking with the Russian minister and the amount of control they have, and the same with the Saudis, as opposed to Texas being the biggest producing state and having so many varied and unique interests. I had written a white paper for the Department of Energy in March, similar at the time. Everyone in industry is trying to be thoughtful and try and help advocate for a solution. The solution that I thought, the two things I thought were most effective potentially, and again, and I want to talk to you about this, the getting consensus politically and what that machine is like, especially in a year like 2020 where ESG was a big thing, our industry wasn't particularly loved, and you're trying to balance all these. But the white paper I wrote had two proposals. Number one was to allow the federal offshore Gulf of Mexico wells to be shut in because they're predominantly federal and the feds could have impacted that. That would have reduced roughly 2 million barrels a day of supply, which would have reduced the amount of inventory that had to go into Cushing that ultimately when April came and oil went negative. So, and do some sort of royalty payment or like a VPP of some kind, because those wells could obviously be easily shut in and turned back on because of hurricanes. And then number two was flaring, which we're going to come back to. But I'm curious, as you reflect on the state of the industry today and the fact that you could talk to the Russian minister and the Saudi minister who control all the decisions of 10 plus million barrels a day. And in the US, there's hundreds of companies with different levels of debt and different levels of management comp and private and public. And how was that talking to the companies in the US?
Such a great question. In fact, I have to use another anecdote to tell you this. I mean, I have made connections with probably every mid-sized to small oil and gas CEO in Texas over the last 6 years, right? So, and I know them all on a first-name basis. And, a lot of people don't realize this. When you're talking about, the CEOs of Concho and Diamondback and Oxy and Pioneer, I mean, these are thoughtful, intellectual, strategic people. A lot of people who aren't in the oil business picture us as a bunch of cowboys out there just punching holes in the ground and hoping black gold comes out. I mean, the amount of infrastructure and organization that it takes to make sophisticated oil production happen, most people just don't appreciate. And once again, when you're talking about Scott Sheffield at Pioneer, you're talking about I'm thinking about
Matt Gallagher.
Diamondback.
Travis Dice at Diamondback, yeah.
I mean, these guys are all, Lee Tillman at Marathon, all thoughtful, all introspective, all intellectual guys. And a lot of these conversations got emotional. And I don't mind telling you that. I mean, I'm not picking on any one here, but it was heated. And you had some that, man, Ryan, absolutely, we've got to do something. We've got to prorate. We've got to do something because there's going to be so much bankruptcy and so much loss that we won't be able to recover. And some of these guys weren't talking about their own companies. They were saying, I can look forward a year and say, when I'm ready to drill wells again, there's just no people around to drill those wells because they've all gone home for a year because of this downturn. On the flip side, I had guys saying, Ryan, we are free market. The market works. How can you even be thinking about this? The market will work itself out. If I'm a low-cost producer, then good for me. If I'm not, that's my problem. I mean, it was an emotional debate. But what I would say is, in trying to build that consensus, even people who I disagreed with, we were able to have both intellectual and emotional conversations. But it never got antagonistic, right? Even heated, but not antagonistic. And that was really neat to see this. Kind of everyone trying to balance the interest of my company, kind of preaching my book, if you will, versus the interest of our state and our industry and frankly, our nation. It was a real something I'd never experienced before, and it was an interesting exercise. You ask about contrasting, right? Alexander Novak, he can say that's it. We're gonna take 2 million barrels a day off the market. And he basically has autonomy to do that, barring what Putin tells him to do. Same thing with the Saudi oil minister, right? The crown prince over there, the Saudi oil minister and the crown prince can decide unilaterally what they want to do. Now, of course, the flip side of that, we all got to appreciate, one of the reasons that the U.S. oil industry moves so dynamically, the reason we're able to put new oil on the market so quickly, drill wells, put in new pipelines, everything, is because of all of these independent businesses that are spending their own dollars. At the same time, one of the things that makes the U.S. energy industry so powerful is our integration. If you look at really the value of a barrel of oil is not when it comes out of the ground, it's when it comes out of a gas station going into somebody's tank. Mm-hmm. Well, the process from drilling that well to producing that barrel to getting in that pipeline, going to that terminal facility, getting another pipeline, going to a refinery, going through another pipeline. I mean, all of those are different companies who all have to work together to try to match and predict infrastructure. The fact that we do that in a way that is not only competitive, but it is quicker and more effective than the rest of the world is really awesome. And in fact, I would say it is because of that because all of these company CEOs are used to having to work in that kind of collaboration is why our industry thrives, where others can certainly have more control when things are up and down, but they don't grow and react as quickly as we do. So you see both sides, both the benefits and the penalties, if you will, of having that autonomy when you see this kind of hyper contrast in a year like we have this year.
How did you think through just recently this week the Saudi cut of 1 million barrels a day? I would say broadly the market was surprised by it. What do you think? What do you think the ultimate maybe the thing that made them make that decision? Do you think it's a demand related thing? Is it an inventory thing? Is it a swing producer thing? Is it just because OPEC, it fell apart in March? We saw that was a contributing factor to the COVID demand reduction that you talked about. But Saudi, they've been talking as recently as in December, where it took, instead of 2 days to make a decision, it took 5. And then they said, well, we're going to ramp up 500,000 barrels per month. And then all of a sudden the Saudis pull 1 million barrels off the market in February. I'm curious how you responded to that and what you thought of it personally.
Yeah, what I love about the analysis of the Saudi oil, in fact, this feeds right into crucial decisions. If you think about how the Saudis are making decisions, imagine that you and I were the Saudi crown prince and the Saudi oil minister. We are playing the long game. There's no question. The Saudis announced that, they telegraphed it. Look, we're not trying to balance production and balance the budget today. We're trying to provide for the long-term interest of our nation for the next 20 years, right? 30 years, 40 years, whatever. Mm-hmm. And so think about it this way. Let's rewind back to February of last year when OPEC kind of fell apart and all of a sudden the Saudis dumped oil on the market. The Russians said, fine, we're not cutting a thing. The Kuwaitis said, well, if Saudi's dumping oil, we're going to dump oil. Next thing, oil prices are starting to tank. And this is before coronavirus made it onto U.S. shores. Then things seem to go further. Well, gosh, what's the Saudi strategy there? Right? What's going through their minds? Now, I did have some conversations with several people who were close to the Saudi royal family, who are close to not only OPEC members. And look, once again, Saudis aren't exactly being secretive about this. They're saying the OPEC collaboration only works if we all play. At the end of the day, if some of us are cutting and some of us are not, this just doesn't work. And the only real tool Saudi has to make sure everyone plays is to crush prices. Right? If you say, I'm going to dump oil on the market because I've got enough sovereign wealth that I can weather the storm for a while, but you guys in Iraq and you guys over in Venezuela, you guys are all going to go bankrupt in a matter of months. So you can choose. Either we'll have low oil prices and you go bankrupt, at which point I'll feel the pain now, but I'll win on the backside. Or you play with the club and we all agree to cut. I mean, that's really what their strategy was. And you could argue or debate the logic, but in the end, they've pretty much been successful with that strategy. Go all the way back to 2015 or 2014 when they announced, hey, we're not going to cut anymore. We keep cutting because the U.S. keeps producing more. We're not going to do it anymore. We're going to just open the taps a little bit more. Prices came down through 15 and 16. U.S. oil production began to crimp, and then they put oil back on the market. Now, what they didn't, I don't think, consider was when they did that, cost of U.S. production dropped a lot in that. So we were producing tons of barrels in 2013 and 14, but our cost to produce those barrels were skyrocketing because we were throwing money at people and infrastructure, everything else. When they tanked prices, what happened was U.S. producers got really efficient. So once prices started to come back, we were actually able to produce even more. So I think there was a little bit of, we didn't anticipate that just right. But go back to what happened this week, to your question. I think what's going on is the Saudis are playing the long game, and they're trying to balance two things. One, we need some oil prices. Let's say a lot of people tend to speculate $60 to $70 a barrel is where the sort of ideal Saudi per barrel price is to sustain their country, right? Their infrastructure. But they also are beginning to think, hey, this isn't going to last 50 years. I mean, regardless of what you believe on ESG issues and demand and everything else, they are seeing that between now and 2050, oil demand is growing pretty slowly. So they're saying we got to move into other areas. So I think what you saw in the gamesmanship, if you will, between last month and this month was we're going to continue to flex our muscles to force all the other people to play ball. But in the end, what we can also do is when we need to, we're going to push prices up. So they may have some initiative. They're trying to fund investments in technology, alternative energy sources, becoming an automobile manufacturer. There's some speculation they're getting in more into manufacturing. So let's pump up oil prices, especially the ones coming our light sweet crude taps, which really are between that Brent and some of the U.S. crudes really are the lightest, sweetest crudes. We'll get a premium for that for the next 6 months, and then we can invest all that money into new things that we want to take our country in terms of direction. So I think it's always this, how do we balance bringing in as much revenue as we can, yet maintaining control over OPEC? Virtually every move they make is viewed through the combination of those two lenses.
So when you think about the CEOs and the time that you were with the RRC and the change in discipline, because I think the pushback potentially is that the dancing of the bulls, if you've been on Twitter, or if you've been on LinkedIn, or if you've been anywhere downtown, assuming people are allowed to be downtown, people have been thrilled about the OPEC cut. And oil has moved from the sentiment the last week of October, just before the election, was horrible. Oil was 35, coronavirus lockdowns, and all of a sudden it changed, and now we're up 50%. And everyone's been very excited. And we've seen through Q4, where companies have ramped up rigs, we've seen frac spreads have tripled since the bottom. Part of that is obviously covering declines and for debt servicing. But now we have $50 oil, which arguably is where we were back in February, and producers want to be drilling their assets. So how do you think the discipline of these companies will change, having been through 2020 and having seen these CEOs and these companies over the course of your time with the RRC?
I would say well, first of all, let me set the context for what I'm about to say. In general, what drives discipline is the balance between long-term and short-term, right? Yeah, I could be talking about my kids, right?
Right.
I've got a 16-year-old, about to be 17-year-old, and a 15-year-old, and an 11, about to be 12-year-old. At the end of the day, discipline is their ability to say, I'm not going to do what I feel like today because I'm trying to accomplish or do something longer term, right? That's kind of the nature of discipline. But one of the things that we are constantly challenged with in the oil business is the fact that short-term gains outweigh long-term gains 9 times out of 10. That's not a referendum on CEOs or on an individual company. It's kind of the nature of the market. Let's take the general stock market. How much do stock prices swing based on what happens today, even though nothing long-term has changed? I mean, we see that constantly. In fact, most good investors, the Warren Buffett kind of echelon of investors, say, I try not to pay attention to stock prices today. I look at the long-term market, where long-term opportunities are, who is well-positioned to take advantage of those opportunities. That's who I invest in. Now, I, of course, consider how are they priced today versus their potential down the road, but in the end, I'm playing the long game. Well, a lot of oil CEOs, private equity companies, publicly traded companies, they're struggling to sort of put out the long-term view and say, I'm playing the 5-year game, when if you're a private equity firm, hey, we're trying to flip this thing in 2 years. Or if you're a publicly traded company, the shareholders are wanting to know what's the next quarter looking like and what's the annual dividend looking like. How many people have scrutinized the Exxon and Chevron decisions to borrow money to pay dividends? There's a lot of gnashing of teeth over whether or not that really is a good long-term decision, or if it's just meant to kind of keep the stock price propped up. Go back to, though, I do think one thing that has certainly changed the discipline, if you will, or the thought process of an oil company CEO today, and it's access to capital. A lot of people believe, or you hear a lot of speculation, that the reduction in cash flowing into investment into oil and gas is driven by ESG issues. I will tell you that I believe that is an issue. I do not believe that's the dominant issue. I think the number one issue that banks and investors are pulling out of oil and gas is because if you look over the last 10 years, the returns from oil and gas have been poor. There have been too many shocks to the system where people bought stock in or invested in service companies or oil companies based on reserves or current profile that ended up tanking, and they lost a bunch of money. And so that, at the end of the day, investors regardless of what their social agenda or this ESG agenda is, their primary agenda is to get a return on that investment. And the oil business has been a challenge for most investors over the last 10 years. And so you're seeing that. Well, the access to that capital, where people are pulling out, and the access to less capital is forcing the oil company CEOs to say, how do I manage a growing business when I have to manage much more out of cash flow? And so that one thing is changing the discussions, and I'm having them every day with oil company CEOs about how they're restructuring their business, their spend patterns, their capital allocation, knowing that most of this is going to have to come out of cash flow. And even if when I do get debt, that debt is going to be required, or is going to come with it a requirement to be backed up by pretty good cash flow. So that, I think, is probably the number one thing that we're seeing. And as a result, I will tell you, and look, I think about, I own a small business. I say small, we own a decent sized business. As we think not just about where our company's going, how we manage out of cash flow, when we look at treasury management, where we are investing our dollars, outside of our company, we look at companies who have good cash flow, who are managing within their book of business, and then how are they positioned relative to the market long term? That's who we invest in. One last thing on this. People ask me, Ryan, what do you think about the oil business? I will tell you, I've got a disproportionately large amount of my personal investments are in the oil business right now. Because when I look at the stock market, I think a lot of stocks out there are pretty highly valued. A lot of sectors. Technology is way over. I just sold Zoom stock, which I bought about a year ago for
well done on that.
Everybody gets lucky every once in a while. But tech stocks are so overvalued. You look at the market segments out there, arguably oil is the lowest value per revenue and profit of all the segments of industry that you can invest in. So as a result, not because I'm familiar with the industry, but that's just a good place to buy given the long-term demands. So long way of saying, I think that thinking about cash flow, running a good performing, stable business, a little bit more conservative mindset is going to benefit a lot of companies. And you're seeing that change in their leadership.
So discipline, and we'll get to Crucial Decisions, which is the book you've released. But when I think about discipline, I think about flaring. And that was a really poignant issue at a poignant time. And I think similar to the proration, nothing really got done for the same reasons that you have a whole bunch of different CEOs and angles. I'm curious your take on flaring in the context of ESG, and I 100% agree with you that the reason oil and gas companies haven't got investment is because we haven't done well over 10 years. And from a valuation basis, they didn't justify investment. As soon as we saw constructive oil prices, everyone has launched into oil and gas stocks in the last 6 weeks, which is not based on ESG. It's based on, I believe there's something there because the future's rosy. But on the discipline piece, what was your take on flaring? How did that, in your opinion, get managed? And what would you do about the flaring, I put it in quotes, problem? Because I would say that's the number one thing that is controllable that should be dealt with by industry. How would you deal with it? And what was your sort of post-appraisal of how it was dealt with at the RRC in 2020?
Well, I'll start with the answer to your last question. How was it dealt with at the RRC this past year? I would say poorly. And part of that was that once coronavirus hit, the amount of flaring dropped substantially just because people were shutting in wells. It became the sort of distant, look, we're just trying to survive as a company. So people weren't ready to talk about flaring a lot last year. But I like the way you set this up. Look, is flaring a discipline question? The answer to that is both yes and no. Now, like most political debates that you get into, whether you're talking about prison, criminal justice reform or education reform, always the issues are more complex than the political dialogue is, right? That's universal. In the case of flaring, I think the nuances that get missed are, look, we could take action, the Railroad Commission take action tomorrow and shut down all flaring. Would that result in less, if your main issue was reducing CO2, right, which is kind of the way that the ESG community approaches it. Man, you're flaring off all this gas. That's so much CO2 going in the atmosphere. If I shut in every flare in Texas, would that result in less CO2 going into the atmosphere? The answer is a resounding no. Because what happens is when you shut all those wells in, that will shut in a lot of oil production that can't be produced without those flares running. When that oil comes off the market, it probably is to the tune of something like, in Texas alone, where we produce, call it 4 million barrels a day, 3 million to 4 million now. You're probably talking about 1 million to 1.5 million barrels coming off the market in Texas. At the same time, prices spike because you've shown that, hey, we're going to have that's if you're going to shut down all flaring, that's going to mean a long-term impact. Oh, all that oil now gets produced somewhere else. Well, in other areas around the world, they produce oil with a whole lot more flaring than we produce here. So one of the discussions you have to have is, at the end of the day, if our objective is to reduce CO2 output, how can we do that in the context of flaring without triggering more CO2 production overseas? And so the answer to that, in my mind, fairly simply, is this idea of what they call flaring intensity. Now, to tell it myself, we introduced this concept in a report that I did last year where I just looked at some data. I said, look, who produces how much oil and how much gas are they flaring as a ratio? And we called it flaring intensity. Come to find out, somebody had actually done the exact same thing and called it flaring intensity like 10 years prior. So I got accused of plagiarism. I just couldn't find that report. So to give credit, somebody else had actually come up with that term ahead of time. It was just coincidental. But anyway, by setting a flaring intensity target where you say, look, we understand flaring is a part of the development process and it is going to happen. However, let's gauge how much you flare relative to how much oil you produce, not just on a development basis, but on a continuous basis. And then you simply start by reporting that by company, which I did last year. But if the Railroad Commission and even other regulators around the state matched that, then we'd find out that, wow, in Texas, you have this kind of flaring intensity. In North Dakota, you have this. In Oklahoma, you have this. In Louisiana, you have this. And it creates a standard framework by which to view the externality of natural gas flaring in the context of how much oil you produce. So I think that's the direction. I think just the reporting itself would create some discipline. In fact, to tell Travis Stice, I mentioned him earlier with Diamondback, he's been very public about his company reducing flaring. He told me that they are using the flaring intensity metric that we put out in our report last year when he reports to his board. So saying, look, that's a good measure. We're going to use it. We compare how we rank in terms of flaring intensity to our peers, to the rest of industry, to the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, he's telling his board, I'm reducing our flaring intensity. So therefore, the ratio of how much gas I flare to how much oil I'm producing is going down. And he set his own target around that. So I think by having a common measure, you create discipline, even if you don't force anything. Then over time, a year or two, what you could do is look and say, okay, as we've tracked this measure and we see how people are using it, we can begin to set targets as regulators to say, if you're over this, you need to do something to get into control. Which goes back to your question, how did we do at the Railroad Commission? We weren't able to make progress on that. And I think that as regulators, not just in the Railroad Commission, but around the country, taking that sort of approach is going to be, we're going to have to do that. Because the sort of, hey, just kind of do your best isn't going to cut it. And even the industry leaders know that. So there is consensus to do something where it's going to take a little bit more intentional leadership, though, to actually get something done. But I'm optimistic it will come in the next year or two.
Well, so there's a couple of places I want to take this. Number one, the RRC is a political post, correct? So there's actually elections you run. Yep. And you had started the comment around there's nuance in politics. And so, in light of the Georgia runoffs yesterday, we've all seen the election in 2020. We've seen the sound bites that get put out from either side. And we just had a very long conversation about the nuance of CO2, that if it's not produced here, it will be produced elsewhere. So flaring intensity is the right argument. And one of the subtexts of that argument is if you weren't focused on CO2 and you were just focused on energy conservation, and that we have a limited non-renewable resource, the burning of natural gas, which can be used to heat homes in Aspen, flaring it is bad, and needing more pipelines and pre-building those pipelines and holding companies accountable for better planning is also related. But you and I could have that conversation for 45 minutes, and a voter or a constituent or an activist isn't there to have, because they're watching a news clip, which is a 45-second conversation that you have to boil all that down into like 90 words. So how do you think that, like, as a politician, and I mean that not in a disrespectful way, I mean it in a loving way, but how do you communicate with the different constituents given those nuance? And with the rise of social media and anger politics and partisan politics, how do we get back to discussion in the news instead of just the flamboyant 30 seconds from Greta and everyone gets upset?
Yeah. Boy, that last question you asked there, how do we get back to that? I will tell you, In fact, let me make a bold statement I 100% unequivocally condemn the actions that were going on in D.C. yesterday by quote unquote Republicans, Trump supporters, whatever you want to call it. And I made a statement on social media. Look, I thought Black Lives Matter or Democrat leaders failed last year when they didn't condemn the riots that resulted out of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Demonstrations are always okay, right? That's part of our right to assemble, our right to free speech. You want to demonstrate, great. But at some point, a leader should have stepped up and said, hey, these riots are not only not okay, but in fact, in the middle of coronavirus, everything else, we need to be really thoughtful. But I get the angst over what's happened with the police and the sensitivities in the black community over this. But whether or not this is productive and safe and healthy, we need to think about. And no one stood up and really said that. And I thought that was a failure from those leaders. Similarly, yesterday, I thought that no Republican leaders are coming out now and saying, oh, that was not okay. But the fact that all there was yesterday was tweets, as opposed to what I would have liked to seen was a leader. I would have liked to seen the president show up with Secret Service right in the middle of D.C. and say, you people stop doing this.
Yeah.
This is not what we believe in. And so there's a lack of leadership in politics across the spectrum today to stand in the middle of the fray and say, this is not okay, and we need to course correct. Now, back to what's going on in the future, my hope is, regardless of your political persuasion, Joe Biden's a pretty boring guy. And I mean that in a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but you look at Obama and George Bush because of the Middle East conflict and Donald Trump. These were all, either because of their personas or because of the times that they were president, had very sensational presidencies. Well, Biden's coming in, and he's been in politics 47 years, and most people can't name a single major kind of event or accomplishment. Maybe this gives us a little bit of framework to have more intellectual debates because we're not reacting to tweets all the time. And so I'm optimistic that maybe that's the landscape we find ourselves in now. Unfortunately, because the Republicans lost the Senate yesterday, there's going to be a willingness to sort of ramrod through Democrat legislation. So we may end up another slew of sensational politics as a result of that. We'll see. But back to your question about let's bring it all the way back to natural gas. How do you frame these issues up? What you do is you have to find the thing that really connects all the voters. And on energy, one thing that is pretty ubiquitous, regardless of most people's political persuasion, is people want energy in this order: affordable, reliable, and then environmentally responsible. Now, that last one is a pretty broad kind of notion, but the first two are not. When people flip on the lights, they want them to come on.
Yeah.
When they go to the gas station, they want gas, right? You go to other countries around the world, the way they experience brownouts and oil shortages, that's unacceptable. So I said affordable, reliable. Sorry, reverse that. They want it reliable, then affordable.
And then affordable, yeah.
And so then affordable. I mean, people have context for that. If you're in Texas, $2.50 is affordable gasoline. $3 is getting low price. So you get $3.50, we got a problem. So if I go out and say, hey, I can reduce all this flaring and conserve this gas, but as a result, the price of oil does this, the price of refining margins does this, and the price of their end refined product does this, and you're paying $5 a gallon at the pump, that's unacceptable. I don't care. In fact, believe it or not, that's even more unacceptable to Democrat voters than it is to Republican voters. So within that context, that now gives a framework for us to talk about whatever issue we want to talk about. How are we doing things to maintain affordable, reliable, affordable energy to the 85% of our consumers for whom that is the way they think about energy? That helps. And that's incumbent upon us as politicians, as leaders, to frame the issues in the ways that really matter. And frankly, our political leaders don't do that very well today, both sides of the aisle. They tend to get caught up in the rhetoric, not in the objective.
I like the way you tied two things into that, which was the first one, which was the condemnation of what happened in Washington, which no one supported, similar to the condemnation that all of us felt in the incident of George Floyd that led to the Black Lives Matter protests and ultimate riots. And with 100% certainty, the politicians and the left-leaning media were not condemning it. If anything, they were fanning the flames. I did find it ironic a little bit that curfew was imposed yesterday in Washington at 6 p.m., whereas I recall during the Black Lives Matter riots in Denver, the curfew was like 8 or 9 or 10, and I sort of went on social media as well and said, you can have a protest at 2 in the afternoon and socially distance and have balloons. Nothing good happens after dark. And so, like, I commend them for implementing the curfew. Obviously, it got restrained, and it was a much smaller event, and it doesn't look like it's going to spin out of control. But I'd like that you stepped up and addressed the fact that there was hypocrisy on both sides, and it is incumbent on politicians to step into tough issues and then also frame them in a way that relates to consumer behavior, because in the fossil fuel industry, we produce the product, but it is consumers who are ultimately releasing the CO2, and we don't have that conversation. Let's talk about crucial decisions. So recent book. When was it released?
Last month. I mean, 6 weeks ago, something like that. So it's fairly new.
What's it like releasing a book in COVID times, where you can't really book tour and do all the things that you would usually do to help promote it?
Well, you certainly appreciate social media, right? I mean, the platform, and I don't have a huge platform. Frankly, I probably don't have as many followers as you do, but between Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, you're announcing your book, you're connecting with readers. The timing of the book was really crucial, if you'll pardon the pun, because of its connection to coronavirus. I'm really at my heart a data geek, and I've spent the last really 15 to 20 years of my career in engineering, but constantly using data to help affect how refineries and chemical plants and mining operations do business. And I've been working on the concepts in this book for probably 3 or 4 years. But then when coronavirus hit, it was like, wow, we've never had an event this large in which the data was telling us that we should be doing things that for some reason we're not doing. The reactions in the public domain, the decisions to shut down, the decisions to do things don't seem to line up with data. In some cases, it just was absent data, so it was just speculation. In other cases, it just frankly was a big miss. And we're doing this, but data says to do this. And so the opportunity to integrate some data analytics around coronavirus made this book really become all of a sudden very timely. And so we went and released it now. But yeah, it's an interesting exercise through a lot of what you and I are doing right now to get the message out and let people know. A lot of people are asking, man, what really do we know about coronavirus? I mean, is there anybody that's talking about what the data tells us? Well, that was the point. Let's get this book out there so that people can read that.
So let me ask, because I wasn't going to dive into the coronavirus, and we're going to touch on it very lightly because it's controversial, but we're going to put it in the context of social media and narratives, because a number of people have been banned, deplatformed, posts taken down for advocating that we perhaps haven't done the right thing. And part of it a little bit is this Section 230, and it was unfortunate that it got tied into some of the stimulus check, but in aggregate, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook were making decisions on what was appropriate to pass, what a conversation was allowed to be. And I got deplatformed on LinkedIn for a time because I was saying that there was virtually 0% chance of dying if you were under 50 and healthy. And it also strikes me that most doctors I talk to admit that obesity is not just like a comorbidity, it's like the comorbidity. And so, but if you were to go out and you were a politician or even a media and say, well, if you're fit and you work out and you eat well, you're going to be fine. But the fatties, you guys are in trouble. Like, no one would even care. Like, we'd all be back to our life. So there's this management of data that's been so tight and done by the mainstream. So I'm curious in that context with 230, the lack of dialogue, the shaming for even having this conversation. How do you feel about that? And how do we move forward as a country as the vaccine rolls out and as the data continues to show that the lockdowns were worse? The cure was worse than the disease. Curious your response.
Yeah, in fact, let's quickly just give an anecdote that isn't politically controversial. It's just facts, right? We locked down a large portion of the country between March and April. The idea was let's prevent the spread, and that was effective. No question. By locking down, that was effective. But then after a while, you say, well, look, we've got to open back up because our world won't work unless we do, right? Not everybody can work from home. Someone's got to go to farms and go to plants. I mean, we've got to open back up. Restaurants are going out of business. I mean, this world won't work, so let's open back up. We open back up, and the virus continues to spread. So you look back and you go, wait a minute. Why lock down then to this degree, to open back up to this degree, and the virus is just going to spread again? In other words, we locked down way too early. And the data showed that. So what we should have done is start taking some precautions, especially people who are at risk. My mom, for example, has Alzheimer's. She's in a facility. That facility has a lot of at-risk patients. Absolutely. Early on, they should have locked that facility down and said, you can't come in or out. We're highly testing. I mean, great. But for a lot of us, let's keep going about our business, take some precautions, but not lockdown. That way our economy doesn't go boom. We can maintain something, and we can sort of regulate up and down a little bit to manage this thing as it goes forward. I mean, that's not controversial. That's just the facts. That's what the data tells us now. Well, go back to your question. Why didn't we have the ability to have that exchange? And this is going to be one of probably the fundamental, I would say, questions of our time in history. Now that so much communication is done via social media, in which arguably 3 or 4 companies control maybe 80% of the information exchange in our world. Well, man, if that's not a monopoly, I don't know what is. If you look at when they broke up Standard Oil, because Standard Oil controlled 95% of the world's oil, or 95% of North America's oil at the time. Now you're looking at platforms that can control dialogue all day long. If Facebook decides that your business is going to be successful, they can absolutely make that happen unequivocally. So if you've got the right relationships, you're paying the right prices, whatever. I mean, gosh, that's pretty close to monopoly, right? And so one of the things, we've never thought about monopoly in information flow. We've always thought of it in goods and services. Well, now in information flow, that's going to be a pretty fundamental question. It wouldn't surprise me if in the next 10 years, there are conversations about breaking up some of these monopolistic social media platforms just because they have too much control over our society. So much so that the regular media is no longer competing with themselves, right? CNN, Fox News, MSNBC used to compete with the local networks, ABC, NBC, those guys, to say, am I giving the content that my viewership is interested in? And so there was a competition there. Well, now social media has gotten so sensational that everyone directs their attention there, and the regular media said, man, I've got to be sensational to compete with that. So now headlines no longer really relate to the facts and the story. They're purely designed to garner your attention. So there is a real shift in our ability to get sort of unbiased information because there's just no platforms left to deliver it. And that, as I said, I think that's going to be, it won't surprise me in the next 10 years if that's the soul searching that our entire country, our society does to figure out how do you address that problem? Because that is the thing that seems to be leading to so much malcontent and so much angst and so much anger in our society because we're not having the intellectual discussions. We're only having the sensational ones.
Well, and I think the subtext to that, which is also interesting, not only do the big companies control the flow of information, but they actually themselves benefited from the lockdowns. And when you look at what has happened to the Amazons of the world through, Whole Foods and Google with the cloud and search and Twitter and Facebook, like they not only did they control the narrative, but the narrative of the lockdowns and moving everyone more like to a tech platform actually massively benefited them. So then there was a double incentive to manage the narrative, as much as we hate to say that. But if you're a business owner, you're making the best decision for your shareholders. And for shareholders of Amazon, they benefited dramatically from the lockdowns. So 2 more questions while I have you. And the first is, I think you're extremely well-spoken, charismatic, have a presence. And it's kind of funny because we both have sort of the same skin tone, and I find myself wishing I looked more like you. I'm going to have to work out and do something with my beard. But so politics, you're very good at it. You communicate very effectively. What's next for you in the political landscape? Because I'm sure that many of your fans and those who don't follow you yet but will want to know what's next for Ryan.
Well, let me actually lay that out. It's funny that you wouldn't think that would tie into a book I just wrote, but let me tie that together. My passion is not to be in politics. My passion is to make an impact. And one of the things that this conversation we just had about communication and the flow of information, the whole point of Crucial Decisions was that book is all about making decisions using more data and more logic and not just emotion and conjecture. And we live in a world today where most of our decisions are made in emotion and conjecture. And if you've ever studied behavioral economics, in fact, the book Moneyball, right, or if you've seen the movie Moneyball, that's all about a bunch of baseball scouts who thought they knew how to recruit players. Billy Beane comes along and says, the data says you guys have no idea how to recruit players. And the storyline begins in 2002 with the Oakland Athletics. Today, every single baseball team, basketball team, football team has shifted the entire way they think about recruiting players and building teams based on what Billy Beane was doing. Well, what most people don't know is that the basis of Billy Beane's work in 2002 with the Oakland Athletics was actually a guy named Bill James from the 1970s who started writing that the stats they used in baseball weren't good. They were not the right stats, but it took literally, 30 years before that was used in baseball, and then another 20 years before it became kind of mainstream, or 50 years later, but that concepts are sinking in. So you asked me, Ryan, and you're very, very gracious in your compliments. Thank you. The future for me in politics is when you look at things like our education system. Both my parents were teachers. Between my dad and my mom, they have a combination of like 90 years of education between the two of them. And our education system is good. But for as much money as we sink into education, we're not getting the returns for our kids that we should be. But to change that, it's going to be a force, right? To change an education system that almost all of us were a part of is very emotional. How do we look at data around education and say, where can we move and shift this system to better spend those dollars to get more for our kids than what we're getting today? Look at a healthcare system. How much are we spending on treating symptoms of disease as opposed to the underlying causes of disease when it's cheaper and more efficient, but we don't have the data to do that. So my future in politics will be, if there is a way, and education is a big passion of mine, where I see we can affect things, but we've got to bring this more logical, more data-oriented approach for these very complex problems. Well, I've got methods to do that. That's what the book is about, and that's, who knows, maybe I run for governor someday with the objective of let's use the tools at our disposal to really make leaps that we've never been able to make before.
Well, I truly hope you do. I had original when I sold One Energy with my partners, I'd sort of thought about running for governor in Colorado. Now I happen to be in the wrong state to be a Republican. But then I also am a little bit too flamboyant and say too much what's on my sleeve. But I love you're able to communicate in such an effective way that you're not having to be as controversial to make the same point. So I commend you, and I commend your public service. If you could go back and meet yourself when you were 20 and give yourself some advice and say, Ryan, here's the deal. I've learned this. This is going to help accelerate you on your journey to this. And what advice would you give to yourself that would influence other young people who might be listening right now?
Man, I love that question. Thanks for asking it. It would be this. It is so easy. In fact, myself, 20 years ago, I was just getting out of college. I was about to go work for my first company. My first company was Oxy, as a matter of fact, when I got out of college. And I would tell myself, you're going to assume that the world you're going into is set. You're going to work for this company, Oxy. They've got ways of doing things, and you're going to assume that it's set. Assume that it's not. Assume that every way that things are being done out there today was invented 20 years ago, and it took 20 years to become main practice. Look for opportunities to make changes all the time. However, know that because you're only 25 years old, Ryan, no one's going to listen to you. So what you also have to do is learn. You're also going to come out the world assuming that, hey, I just got my mechanical engineering degree from Texas A&M. I'm a big shot. Education time is over. It's now time to go out and make some bucks. And I'm here to tell you that mindset is so backward, and it took me probably 10 to 15 years to figure that out. Really, the last 10 years have I been at the point where I'm reading all the time. I'm studying. I'm learning faster today, really, than I ever have. I'm studying psychology and behavioral economics. I'm actually getting my PhD in data science right now. I'm writing books. Never thought 10 years ago, much less 20 years ago, I would do that because I didn't think about growth as something that when I got out of college, that's when the real growth starts. Because now that I direct all my own growth, it's all in areas I'm passionate about and have an effect on my life today. When you're in college, you're learning whatever the professor told you to, or the college course catalog told you to learn. So those two things: one, assume that everything you see out there has an ability to be made better, and two, learn as fast as you can. Immerse yourself in things. Find topics and test yourself to be growing faster than you ever have before, because it's right there in front of you. We just don't have the habits to make it happen.
I love that answer. And with that, Ryan, I really appreciate you joining. Very thoughtful conversation. You're a very thoughtful guy, and I feel good for the future of our country. the larger an office you get to have and the more you can influence people, the better I feel about that state and our country. So I thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you the best this year with the book and with everything you're going on. So we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
All right. Hot Take Nation, until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day.